Welcome from the Fellowship Hall of First United Methodist Church in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. This room is still set up from yesterday when there was a luncheon in here, and it's staying set up because we have another coming up on Saturday. And it's the nearest thing we have in our building to a middle school cafeteria, which is a place that is almost a cliche for social interaction gone bad. And that's a little bit about what Jesus talks about in this week's reading and that I'll address in the sermon, which I hope you'll stick around for and invite you to come and hear in person. But we all know how kids keep track of who is sitting with whom and where they're sitting and who's wearing the right clothing, and they will even make fun of what happens to be on people's lunch trays, or what they pack along with them. And if you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with strawberry jelly instead of grape, yeah, heaven help you if you use apricot marmalade. Actually, I really mean that. That stuff's disgusting with peanut butter. It's okay on its own, but not with peanut butter. Anyway, let's not worry about what I like to eat. Let's hear a little bit from Jesus, from Luke chapter 14. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you're invited by someone to a wedding banquet, don't sit down in the place of honor, in case somebody more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And then, in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you're invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you'll be honored in the sight of all, in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all those who humble themselves will be exalted. And he also said to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers and sisters or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you'll be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." These are Jesus' directions for holding a party. Thanks be to God. Amen. There are all sorts of opportunities for social embarrassment at weddings and at other public occasions where people are sitting down to a meal together. Jesus was very familiar with that kind of a setting. The Gospels talk about him having supper at the home of his friends Lazarus and Mary and Martha, and Jesus landing in the middle of a dispute between the two sisters about who gets to make supper and who gets to eat supper. And I suspect who got to clean up afterward. The Gospels tell us about scenes that took place at a meal with Jesus at the house of somebody named Simon the leper, and about how he invited himself one time to dinner at Zacchaeus' house. There was a wedding in Cana of Galilee where Jesus and his disciples and his mother and all sorts of other people were invited, and things went terribly wrong. And he had to be convinced, actually. He didn't do it on his own. He had to be convinced to change some water into wine so that there would be no social embarrassment to the hosts. And speaking of hosts, Jesus wasn't always the guest. His very last meal with his disciples before his crucifixion was one where Jesus invited them to share a Seder, a Passover meal together, where Jesus was the guest. And after his resurrection, there was an incident where Peter and the others were out on a beach early in the morning, and they had been fishing, and they spotted Jesus on the beach where he had already got a fire going to cook them breakfast. Formal occasions, public occasions, sometimes even these semi-private occasions, and even a lot of less formal get-togethers, even with just friends, can be filled with embarrassing moments. Luncheons, banquets, public events of all types put on clear display, without even mentioning it and without people really being conscious of it, but it's there. A conscious display of where people stand on the social ladder, what their status is, what the proper social interactions among people are supposed to be. And in Jesus' time, people paid special attention to seating as an example of that. Who gets to sit closest to the host indicates who is the guest of honor. That hasn't really changed. But a lot of things still play into that. What's your relationship to the host? What sort of terms are you on with the other people at the table? Do you hold some sort of religious or social position that brings a kind of honor with it? If you are invited to something like this, are you going to be able to return the invitation later on? All of these things go into the mix, and sometimes more than that. Who's getting along with each other and who may or may not have a beef? Do these two have bad blood between them? Has it been going on for a long time? Do we just know that you don't seat Jed next to Rich? That goes on all the time. One of my friends, who happens to be a lawyer, when he was first starting out in Washington, right after law school, went to a gathering of some sort. It was one of those, it was probably a fundraiser or some sort of official thing. I don't remember the details, but what I do remember is he talked about how he walked in to the banquet hall because he didn't really know anybody yet and just looked for an empty spot. And he found one. He saw a table with an empty chair, and he did what is proper. This guy has good manners. He said, "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" And the man who was sitting there said, "No, no problem. Help yourself." And they sat down, and they started talking, and it went along, and things were going very, very well. Everybody seemed to like each other. And They, of course, they introduced themselves to each other. Hi, my name's Pete. I'm Marty. And it was a pleasant meal. Then came time for the keynote speaker afterward. And this being Washington, and this being in the 19 whatevers it was, the speaker was impressive. It was a new justice of the Supreme Court who became known as the notorious RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she started her speech out as you always do, thanking the host for the invitation and recognizing some of the other people in the room. And one of the people that she decided to recognize was pointing to him out in the hall where he was sitting, was her husband, Marty Ginsburg, right next to Pete. And Pete, at the end of all the speeches and things, as everybody was getting ready to go, said to Mr. Ginsburg, "I'm sorry, I didn't know who you were. I apologize for that." And he replied, "Well, I'm kind of glad you didn't know who my wife is, because if you did that, we wouldn't have had as good a conversation, would we?" And that was true. Sometimes there's an underlying sense of deference that is capable of getting in the way of simple friendliness if we let it. And I'm afraid we do. For the most part, it's something we just kind of shake our heads over with regret. Yeah. Too bad people can't just be themselves. But some people find a way to work around it, as apparently Marty Ginsburg knew how to do. But there is a darker side to it. And Jesus addresses that dark side. That is, if you give into that kind of deference and let it overwhelm things, knowingly or unknowingly, you block people out. In a book called Rediscover Jesus, it's one that one of our adult Sunday school groups is going to be looking at in a few weeks. Come join us for it. The author, Matthew Kelly, says a few words about how our tendency to rank people plays out not only in this kind of situation, but in far more serious ones. The problem, he says, is that we value some people more than others. Jesus doesn't do that. If 100 people died in a natural disaster in our city, this would capture our attention for days, weeks, months, even years. If 1,000 people died on the other side of the world, we might barely think of it again after watching this story on the news. And he goes on. Why do we value American lives more than African lives? Why are we comfortable with Asian children sewing our clothing in horrific conditions for wages that are barely enough to buy food? What is so important? Cheap shoes, cheap clothes, cheap drill bits, cheap stuff. Would you be willing to pay a little more? How much more? See, these questions go way beyond where you're sitting. They go way beyond and deeper than trade policy. Ah, but they work themselves out in those ways now, don't they? Jesus is very aware of that and wants us to be aware of it too. He goes right to the very heart of this crazy, radical concept of his that he puts out to his followers and says, let's get out of the practice of evaluating each other's social status, evaluating anybody's status of any sort generally. Just let people be people. He specifically, however, confronts the practice of relating to people on the basis of how much we get out of the relationship. The whole idea of reciprocity as something that's false and something that's harmful, something that is displeasing to God. If any kind of reward or benefit should come out of any of those relationships, let God be the one to determine what it will be. Just concentrate on people as people. He said, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or sisters or your relatives or your rich neighbors in case it's not that they're not welcome, but don't do it in case they may invite you in return. Yeah, they're welcome there. Others are welcome there too. And that includes the people who have absolutely no way to invite you to anything. In case they may invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Back to the banquet hall again. This time, it won't be my friend's story. This time it's going to be one of mine. I was somewhere where I'd been invited to say grace. And I was seated at the front table, right next to the speaker, which I didn't expect. See, the speaker was the governor. This was not in Pennsylvania. Let me lay that out. And I'm not going to give the governor's name because of what I'm about to say. But he was boring. He was so dull. The entire meal, we were stuck up there, and I tried to make small talk. It didn't work. I tried to touch on big subjects. I couldn't get a word out of him. And the man had no thoughts on anything, no observations about anything that was going on, no opinions on any topic, not an anecdote, not even a knock-knock joke. Until they brought dessert. They brought dessert, and then it became even worse because he began to speak. This governor would not, at that point, shut up. He wouldn't stop. And he went on for what felt like the next half hour. It was probably about 5-10 minutes, but it felt a lot longer. He was talking about between spoonfuls of his dessert, which he kept shoving into his mouth, and he even arranged for seconds. He talked about how good the pudding was, and about how he liked pudding, and about how pudding was probably his favorite thing in the entire world, and how it's a shame that chefs get all this training on all these fancy foods, but they never learn to make a decent pudding. This stuff, he would say, waving his spoon, and it's one of those things where you get excited and you're thinking, I hope this guy doesn't spray pudding all over everybody at the table. This pudding was a decent pudding. This was good, not like the cup of pudding that he ate at one of these things last week. Ugh, that was not especially good, but he liked pudding. Oh, did he like his pudding? He liked rice pudding and chocolate pudding, tapioca pudding, banana pudding, but you have to make it with the bananas at just the right kind of ripeness. Um, Anything except vanilla pudding. Vanilla pudding's kind of too bland for him, unless you mix it in with something else and something that has real flavor. Um, he liked a pudding you could really taste on and on and on. And I was relieved when it was finally time for him to stand up and speak. But I was also afraid he was going to tell everybody how pistachio pudding could change your life, or how he'd suddenly had an inspiration to propose a general ban on Jello. As he was doing that, there I was in the place of honor, one of them, wishing that I had instead been seated at the back by the kitchen, away, way back there, maybe near the exit. What a relief it would have been to sit next to somebody who could talk intelligently about anything else. But you know what? When I think about it, now at this distance, I think about what Jesus said about the people that we're to share our meals with, people to share our lives with. And maybe I just didn't realize it at the time, but maybe the governor was one of those emotionally emotionally or socially awkward folks among the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind that he said to invite. And maybe for that matter, I myself was among them, too blind to see what was going on, too blind to see him as a person. Why? Because we were both stuck up there at the head table. In all these directions, Jesus gives us. I think sometimes he knows us better than we know ourselves, which is all the more reason to pay attention to what he says. Amen.